Hi, and welcome to Mr. Wilson Teaches two-part mold making. Today I'm going to show you how to make a two-part mold using plaster. There's lots of ways to do this. There's lots of different materials that you can mold make with. But for this project, because I want to do slip cast molding using clay, I'm going to be using plaster because it can dry out the process and speed it up quite a bit. So some stuff you're going to need. Obviously you need the thing that you want to mold. So this is a pumpkin that I had carved out of clay and shaped up today. So that's what I'm going to be making the mold of. You're going to need some sort of object to create walls. So I've got L-shaped boards that I pre-made. I'm going to place around and then have the plaster sit inside of this using the vice grips, creating a box. But you can use anything else. You can use flashing, you can use clay to build a wall. Anything that can hold the plaster in place, or even a bucket works too. You need the plaster, which is activated by water. You need a mold release. So this is Murphy's oil soap. It's probably the cheapest, easiest one to get your hands on. I'm going to brush to apply it, so this allows the mold to pop out. You're going to need clay you're going to add around to make sure everything's airtight, and then a couple clay tools here and there, like a needle tool, wire cutter, stuff like that. So this mold is going to be two parts. There are many ways or many types of molds that go with one part, two part, three parts, four, depending on the object. So whenever you have something that's not draftable, that means an edge hooks in where your object will get locked in that mold, you have to start adding other parts on. So this can't be done as a one part, because if I were to do the top, this part would get locked. If I was to do the bottom, this part would get locked. So I have to cut this in half so that when I'm putting the mold together, both parts are able to pull apart, and then I can get the object out of that mold. It is possible to do this as a three-part too. So if I want to chop off the top, then chop down the center, I could have it open up and the top pop off, which would actually be an easier style. But for time's sake, I'm going to do this as a two-part mold and hope that it works out. So I'll walk you through the steps, and good luck, and let us know how it goes. Okay, so the first step in this process is creating the line where we want our two separate parts to be. And when you're deciding this, you have to look for the area that's draftable. What that means is this part that's beveled down here, if I were to create a one-part mold, so if this is flipped upside down, poured the slip in, it would not be able to come out because of this bevel. It would get locked in place. So I need to create a line and then cut where it is the largest, so that one part of the mold is up here, other part of the mold is down there. That way when I open it up, it won't get trapped in and I can pull it both out. So to do that, I have it on a wheel, and I'm going to look for this biggest part, so where it starts to turn, and just using needle tool, I'm going to give it a little line so that I make sure it's straight across the whole way. I'm just holding my hand in that area, and then I'm going to use the wire cutter to cut that on the line and try to get as straight as I can. And I'm trying also not to change the shape of this too bad. I want them to be able to fit back together nicely once this is done. Okay, so now I have it separated in two separate parts. I'm going to be lifting off the first part. That's going to be the first mold, and then this is going to be the second one. So I'll take you to the next step where we're actually putting this one into the mold, and I'll explain that process in the next clip. Okay, so what I've started to set up to show you here, that's the piece that we just cut. So see that it's now flat on the bottom. So when that goes on the table, it won't actually bevel in and ruin the mold. I started building the wall using clay. So if you don't have the boards, you can do layer after layer of clay. Work your way up. You can also use flashing, so you can use metal and wrap around it. You can use a bucket, just cut off the bottom, whatever you need to do. So this is the start of one using clay. The setup I have are these L-shaped boards that I've fit the size of that pumpkin and these vice grips. Now these aren't very tall, the pumpkin's actually taller, so I'm going to use a combination. I'm going to stick this on top of my clay outline so that it gets a little height so that it can totally cover each of the areas. So the next thing I'm going to do is wet this area. I'm going to stick the pumpkin there, make sure it's locked on the table. Then I'm going to be using the Murphy's oil soap to coat everything in here so that it pops really easily. So I'm going to take you to that clip, and then I'll show mixing up the plaster. Okay, so I've got the water in here. I'm going to move that around just so I can get a better seal. So I wet that whole area down. I'm going to take the object I'm making that mold of. So by moving it around, I'm sealing it down to the surface. And it is possible, depending on how well you cut it. There could be areas that don't actually touch. So mine was off by just a little bit, so I'm going in and closing all those little gaps. And it might even take a little bit of extra clay, so I got a little gap over here I need to fill. There we go. Yeah, it's probably hard to see on camera, but I'm just making sure that everything is sealed down to the table so no plaster gets anywhere else. I also want to make sure there's a big enough gap between the circle here and the pumpkin. I need room for that plaster. About a finger's length usually does it. Okay, now that I've gotten the pumpkin secured down, given it some space, I'm going to add on a barrier here. So I've already fitted this to go on. Alright, so you want to apply a little pressure down to it. And then you have to create an airtight bond. I'm using the clay around it so that I don't get any leaks. Once one of these leaks happen, it's really hard to fix, especially if it gets bad. So typically you want to spend a little extra time making sure that that doesn't happen. If it does happen, you can take clay and just fill in anywhere on the outside while it's leaking out. You can also take powdered plaster and usually throw that right on, and it almost clots it. So it mixes with the watery plaster and creates pretty good bonds so that it doesn't leak out anymore. Also, all these edges in here, you gotta take extra clay, fill that all the way up to the top because the plaster will seep through here. I'm gonna finish sealing this and then I'll show you that next step. Okay, so I'm just finishing up putting in the Murphy's oil soap. So I've had a brush. I did all these sides. I did the table as well, and a little bit on the pumpkin, especially in places I think might get stuck, like in here. The reason we use this Murphy's oil soap is so it releases, so it doesn't stick. The clay you don't have to worry about so much because it has that natural moisture in which will make it pop out. So coat everything down. It's also important to tell you that these boards that I made, I coated in varnish and lacquer before I used them so that none of the plaster gets stuck in the wood grain. So these were finished even before I started using them. And so this is now all set up, so now we're going to cut over to making the plaster. I'll show you pouring that inside. Okay, now we're going to mix up the plaster. There is a ratio to this. It's about 50-50. You can measure it out or you can just do it by sight. I think it's easier and quicker just to sort of do it by sight. So I've got my water in. Hotter the water, faster this goes. So if you're beginners, start with a really cold water, work your way up so you start to get the feel of it. If you want to get a quick set, you can get that warm water, hotter water, faster. So you want to take the plaster, and we can't just dump all this in or else it won't filter the right way. So you're supposed to be taking scoops and then sifting it through. And then we're letting this all fall into the water, and as this enters the water, it starts to get dispersed out, and that's what creates that good mixture. So I'm putting all this in little by little. And what we're waiting to see on the top, and unfortunately we won't be able to see it on the video, is for little islands to appear. So as you put this in, it'll start basically sucking that down into the mix. Once you start to see little islands appear, that means that it's become saturated with the plaster, and then it's time to start mixing by hand. When you mix, you want to keep as little amount of air bubbles as you can from getting into the mix. So I don't sit here and shake it, I don't use any tools, I won't whisk it around. You basically just put your hand in, just lightly move it around like this, take the chunks in your hand and clean it out as you go, so that it starts to get that nice even mix. Yes, you will get air bubbles, but we're really trying not to get tons of them, or else those will show up in your mold. Alright, I'm going to keep adding this in. Once we get to the next step, which is when the plaster is all mixed up, I'll show you that next board and all the steps you're supposed to take before that. If you're looking and it's your first time using plaster, what you want to see on the top layer surface is a wake. So just like behind a jet ski or a boat in the water, if you take your finger and you run it across that top surface like that and it leaves a mark, that means it's ready. Anything before that, too watery, anything after that will stick, and then it'll go in your bucket and you won't be able to get it out. Also be careful that you don't get this down your drain, because it will clog your pipes as it hardens. So anything extra you're supposed to let harden, sift the water off the top, and then toss out, get rid of the leftover plaster. So I'll cut to when I'm actually pouring this in. Alright, so one of the ways you can tell if this is done too is if it clings to your finger like that. You can see it's not so watery anymore. I did get a lot of air bubbles in there, and like I said, you try to avoid as many as possible. So to get rid of them, start by tapping the bottom, and then you see all those air bubbles come up to the surface. The next part is starting to pour the plaster in. Try to avoid all the splashes if you can. The faster you can get this in, the better, so it can start to settle. And then you want to hit the side so that you release air bubbles. All the air bubbles should be coming up to the surface. Pop any that show up. Now I'll take you to the next step. Okay, so the plaster's been poured, and this will slowly start to harden. If you feel the top surface, as soon as it starts to feel warm, that means that it's starting to set. So the hotter it goes, it's starting to set, and then you're supposed to wait for it to go back down to room temperature, and then you can take the boards off. So this is heated up, it's now gone back in temperature. So I'm going to release 2 of the boards. So I'm going to reuse this for the other side, so I don't want to undo all of them. Might take a little bit of pressure because of the clay. You can see this is all set up now. And then we're going to pull this up, and hopefully that pumpkin will stay in there so that we can do the next step. I'm going to shift this off the table, and then I'll flip this over and show you how to add the top on. Alright, so before I flip this over, there's some harsh edges on here, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of them using my Bird's Awl tool. That way when it sits on the table, it'll be nice and flat. Should clear off an area here. And as you can see, the pumpkin is still snug inside of there, so this will eventually come out once we carve it. The plaster did soak through in a couple spots. I'm going to trim that up too before we add on the other side of the pumpkin. Just going through and pulling out this extra plaster so that I can get a really crisp edge. For some molds you also want to make a key. So a key is somewhere where you dig in so you know which part goes where. Mine I did a circle here, so I don't really need one, but I will put one in to show you. And this only leaked in a couple areas, so it's pretty good. Alright, to show you a key, you're just going to take one of the loop tools, and in one area just start to twist it. And this is just going to make it a lot easier to line it up. So I created a hole right in there so that next time I go to line it up, I'll know exactly which way it goes. Alright, I'm going to jump ahead to the next part. Okay, now that I've got everything cleaned up and my keyhole in, I'm going to find the area where these match up. And some of this was cut a little uneven, which I filled in later, so that may affect it. So I'm just going to trim up a couple spots. Alright, so if done correctly, these should line up perfectly. Just going to apply a little pressure. I'm going to take a tool, I'm going to seal it down to each of the edges. So that the plaster again doesn't go through. If there's anywhere you see that gap, you need to add a little bit of clay. Alright, we also need to add in a hole so that goes to the surface. That way the clay can pop out as we do a slush mold. So a slush mold is when you take the liquid slip, you put it in, whisk it around, let it sit for a little, and then dump it out so it becomes hollow. So to do that, we need to have an opening. So just using your extra clay, I'm going to roll out tube of clay. This doesn't have to be perfect by any means, just something so that when I decide to start pouring, this will eventually be hollow. I can pour it in and pour it back out. I'm going through and making, it's not to be thick enough too, so it's easy to pour in and out, especially because this bottom's going to be carved out anyways. You could do these from multiple points, you can do more than one. For something like this, it's just easier to do the one. I'm going to secure it on. Again, seal proof, you don't want any plaster to get into there. That should be tall enough. So now we're making the second part. So first part's done, second part is on process. So to do this, I'm going to again line this up. We're going to be putting it up. See how that covers my bases, so it's high enough up. And then I'm going to, again, seal all the walls to make sure there's clay there. Murphy soak it all down and do the exact same process. So if you're confused by that, go back to the plaster area of the video, refill it, fill it all up, and then I'll show you the next step after that. Alright, so here's a close-up of that pour, so you can see the area that I just added that clay on in the back is sticking up. So that's the area that the clay is going to go into when you pour the slip, and that's where it's going to come out. So you can see the bottom part, which is already set. That's part one. Part two is finishing up now. So as soon as that comes out, I will show you how to dig out the actual object, and then you wait and dry. And then we'll show you the slush mold. Okay, our next step, now that the mold has dried, this I left over last night just to ensure that it's set up properly. I'm going to crack it open. You can see there are now two parts. And also take a bird's awl with these edges so that when it slams on the table, you want to make sure it doesn't crack all the way through, so get rid of any harsh edges like this. So you can see this is now released. We have our two separate parts. Here's part one, here's part two. I'll bring this closer to the camera for you. You can see some of that detail in there. And then this is my keyhole that I put in before. So that lines up. Really goes through here for the slush mold. And this has to dry for about 2 or 3 days. Make sure it's completely dry before I start the cast molding. So I'll show you that clip in a couple days once it's dried. Now that it's been a couple days, this whole mold has dried. You can see it's a lot more lightweight. All the water is evaporated from it. And both sides have been cleaned out. We're now going to actually fill the mold, so we're reattaching it. So you reline up the keys there. And you're going to rubber band this so there's a lot of pressure on it. So you take the rubber bands and make sure that it's all secured down. And by doing this, when it fills up with slip, the pressure won't make anything pop open. So we're going to rubber band this up and then start pouring the casting slip in. So there's a lot of different types of casting slip that you can use. The kind that I have is a cone 5, cone 6. So when you get the casting slip, just make sure you ask what temperature it is so that you know what to fire to. Another thing that you're going to need besides the casting slip is a funnel, and then I also have a container I use to scoop it out and pour it in. So when you get the casting slip, you put it in a bucket and you start mixing up, and then I'll show you the pour next. Okay, I've got the casting slip and I've got everything set to start filling up the mold. So this is called a slush mold. So I'm first going to fill, trying to make the least amount of mess as possible. I'm going to fill the whole piece using this slip. It's going to start filling up, and because the plaster is dry, it's going to start absorbing the water out of the clay so that it starts to harden. So this has to be timed perfectly, which is harder to do than it sounds, and it takes some getting used to and some practice. So I'm waiting for it to just get the right thickness or absorbed in, so then I can pour the slip back out so that it becomes hollow. So we're actually just making a shell of the actual project. So it seems like you're using a lot of slip, but you really won't in the end because you're going to put a lot of it back in the bucket. I'm also keeping an eye on how full it's getting inside so that I don't overdo it. And you want it to come all the way up to the top and out a little because this is going to absorb. So you can see it there, I've got pouring out the top. I also move it around a little just to get rid of any air bubbles. Smash it a couple times, make sure that I'm filling it all. And then I'm going to let this sit probably for about 5 minutes or so. And then I'm going to show you the next part, which is slushing it out, so pouring it out so that we get just the shell. If you're doing a mold of something else that's not clay, let's say you're doing wax, chocolate, then you're supposed to have the plaster wet so that when it sets in there it hardens and it doesn't absorb into it. So it's a little different depending on what you're using. So I'll show you the next part in just a second where we're doing the slush and pouring it out. Okay, now that the project has set for 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how dry the mold is, I'm going to flip it over. So I've set up these 2 sticks here so that it can let all the clay out, and I can leave it upside down so it can start to drip out. So you're going to take the mold. Typically you want to hold this nice and tight so that it doesn't end up falling out. Then you're going to start pouring out all this extra slip. And I just set it here and let the rest leak out. So this is the slush technique. This gives you a hollow shell. So we only want the outside to be saved or else everything will blow up and crack. So I'm going to wait for this to come out. Then I'm going to let it set for about a day before I actually pop it open. Okay, so the last step in the process is opening up the mold. So I finished this up, the pouring yesterday, and now we're going to crack it open now that it's sat for a day. So you take the bands off, and then hopefully it just pops out, which sometimes works and sometimes does not, depending on your mold and how well it works. And then I'm going to pull this other side out and I'm going to show you the cleaning up part. Okay, so I just pulled this from the mold. You can see there's a couple lines in here that I don't want, so I'm going to go through and smooth those out and then with the sponge fix them up and add on the stem. But that's the process for making these one by one. You just keep pulling them out. I also cleaned up the bottom. So I cut the hole so it looks a little nicer. I'm going to smooth that out as well. And then it's just one after the other, and that's the point of this mold making process. So good luck, hope you enjoy, and subscribe below. So just a quick look at our finished project. Once you're done pulling it out and carving out the edges, you also take a green scrubber, go through and just make sure you can't tell where that seam was. But this is the finished pumpkin that I just pulled out. I'm going to make some multiples of it. So this is what the finished one looks like. And you can watch our other videos if you're wondering how to run the kiln or how to add glaze on for the finishing touches. You can also paint this acrylic, so you can do pretty much any sort of finish you want on as well. So hope you enjoyed.